So in that sense, I want to democratize the story of innovation. I want to make it clear that anyone can do it.
The basic question that a writer asks, I think, is, what should I write about? And, that's the biggest question. There's no help for you either. And it's a total mystery.
But what is common throughout history, throughout time, is that when you have that upstairs, downstairs thing, there's a certain amount of that you can maintain if you're on top through hard power and hard system.
We're absolutely delighted to be back here with our edition, albeit digitally, of JLF Houston. There are so many wonderful authors and speakers who you will hear over the next few days. And I hope they will power your imagination as they have ours to look into the future, into a brighter tomorrow.
On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, Sanjay K. Roy, and all my colleagues at Team Ghattas, Asia Society, and Imprint, we welcome you to the second session of JLF Houston 2021 Virtual Festival. Black Wave, Kim Ghattas in conversation with Seema Sirohi. With extraordinary detail and intricacy, Kim Ghattas' book, Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East is a gripping narrative weaving together history, geopolitics, and culture to present a comprehensive analysis of the Middle East. In conversation with acclaimed journalist Seema Sirohi, Ghattas unfolds a fascinating cast of characters whose lives were severely impacted by the geopolitical contours of the region. Kim Ghattas. Kim Ghattas is an author and analyst with more than 20 years of experience in print and broadcast media, covering the Middle East, international affairs, and US foreign policy. She is the author of Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East, and The Secretary, a journey with Hillary Clinton from Beirut to the heart of American power. She serves on the board of trustees of the American University of Beirut and on the board of directors of the Organization of Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism. Seema Sirohi. Seema Sirohi is a political columnist with 3 decades of experience covering international relations. She has reported from Vienna, Rome, Jerusalem, and Islamabad on major events impacting India's foreign policy. Based in Washington, D.C., she writes on India-US relations with a special focus on India's neighborhood. She is the author of Sita's Curse, Stories of Dowry Victims. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. In these difficult times, we have struggled to bring you JLF Houston 2021 without charging a registration fee. Please support as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. Simply click on the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your contribution is greatly appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, Black Wave, Kim Ghattas in conversation with Seema Sirohi. Over to you, Seema.
Welcome everyone who's tuned in for this event. I promise you'll learn a few new facts about the Middle East, a region that baffles us as it beguiles us. Kim Ghattas's book is extraordinary in its sweep, and it pinpoints 1979 as a seminal year when 3 events took place, which kind of changed the course of not only the Middle East, but countries further out, like in Pakistan. The 3 events were the Iranian Revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini, the siege of Islam's holiest shrine in Mecca, and the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. What followed was a rise in Shia-Sunni rivalry, proxy militias, religious zealotry, and a kind of a cultural unraveling. Kim begins her book by asking the question, what happened to us? So Kim, over to you. Give us a sense of how the region became entrapped in sort of endless violence.
Seema, thank you very much for doing this with me. I'm really delighted to be back at the JLF, the Houston edition. I'm sorry COVID is still keeping us apart, but I'm delighted to be able to participate at least virtually for the second time. The question that you put out there just now, which I begin my book with, what happened to us, is the question that I set out to try to answer throughout the book. And it's a question that haunts a lot of us in the region, because we know that things have not always been as dire as they are in the Middle East these days and over the last couple of decades. We know from listening to the stories of our parents, so not that long ago, that there was a time when Islamic terrorism or cultural intolerance or bigotry were not what defined the headlines. I don't want to say defined our lives, because I still think that it doesn't, but it certainly dominates the headlines, and it silences the ability, it makes it harder for a large majority of us to speak out in favor and in support of pluralism, diversity, and tolerance. So I was just listening to the introduction there of our session. Limiting history to better. I decided to look back first to understand exactly what had happened in this region. And of course, you bring up already very wisely the year 1979, which was a pivotal year in the Middle East, but also beyond, across the world, from including the US, China, and the UK, for many reasons of political changes. But 1979 was truly a seminal year in this region, not only because of geopolitical events, the ones that you just mentioned, but because those events became completely intertwined and they unleashed dynamics that were not only political or geopolitical. You've had many pivotal years in this region and in any country in the world. You know, in the Middle East, you could say that a pivotal moment was the fall of the Ottoman Empire, or the creation of Israel, or the Six-Day War in 1967, or the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. But none of these events really changed the culture of people, the understanding of their own religion, their understanding of their own culture. And that's why I thought that 1979 was so particular. And we can talk about it in some more details, because what it did is not just turn Saudi Arabia and Iran into rivals, whereas they had been friendly countries before, twin pillars in US policy in the region, the king and the Shah of Saudi Arabia and Iran visiting each other. Not only did it turn them into rivals, but it unleashed through that rivalry sectarian identities, which were then weaponized, Sunnis and Shias, against each other in a way that we had not seen for decades, if not centuries. One of the key misconceptions that I try to unpack in my book is to go against the idea that Sunnis and Shias have always killed each other, and therefore they will continue to kill each other, and there is nothing we can do about it. But over the course of history, Sunnis and Shias have probably killed each other less than Protestants and Catholics. That's not to diminish the historical schism that is at the heart of Islam, but just to emphasize that the headlines of today about sectarian violence over the last few decades are very much a contemporary issue. They're not a historical continuation.
Right. So, I want you to describe for us Beirut was known as the Paris of the East. And I grew up in the 70s, we knew of the non-aligned movement and how Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, the president of Egypt, and our own Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, along with Yugoslav President Tito, sort of initiated the non-aligned movement. Everything was anti-colonial, people were moving in a progressive direction. And then, something happened. So describe for us your time growing up, how the cafe culture, people were debating leftist ideas, etc.
So I have to just warn our viewers that things have been a little bit heated in Beirut this week. There have been some violent clashes. And unfortunately, I am hearing some shooting again. So I just want to warn you not to be alarmed. If you do hear shooting, it's far away, but I can hear it. And if it gets really bad, I might have to move away from the windows. But so far, so good. I did grow up in the civil war here, so I can continue doing my business as usual, even while things are blowing off. But not to bring too much of today's tensions, which are not necessarily connected to this discussion, or are to some extent connected to the discussion, but let's stay in the history for a moment, which is the core of our subject. You refer to the non-aligned movement, Gamal Abdel Nasser. It was an era in the region, in the world, of the left, of liberation movements, of anti-colonial and anti-imperial politics. And across the region, that's what defined the politics. But there was, of course, also the pro-American camp and the capitalism, market economy, and so on. And those were discussions that were taking place across this region. And at the time, unlike today, the idea of political Islam or militant Islam was not something that featured in the conversation because it was not yet part of what was available to people. What changed that were a series of events that led to 1979. Of course, Gamal Abdel Nasser lost in his war against Israel, and there was some reckoning there. Was it because people weren't praying enough? Was it because they were not religious enough? So there was some sense there of why had God let down the Arabs in their battle against Israel? It was, of course, the Palestinian cause that was at the heart of a lot of the discussions around the region. But in Iran, you had the Shah, who was in hindsight, perhaps one could describe him as a benign despot, certainly in comparison with what the Iranians are having to deal with today. But he was a pro-American despot, and there was a sense that there was an injustice there. And his white revolution to modernize the country was simply going too far, too fast for a lot of people. And there was a desire amongst many to remove him from power. And revolutionaries, Iranian revolutionaries, were preparing in Lebanon, for many of them, were preparing in Lebanon with Palestinian guerrilla fighters. That's one slightly underreported part of this region's history, which forms the first chapter of my book. They were training with Palestinian guerrillas in Lebanon, where the civil war was already raging, to find ways to topple the Shah in Iran. Amongst those revolutionaries were not just leftist nationalists, but also Islamists. And at the end of the day, a revolution against the Shah, which had started as a mostly leftist nationalist movement, was hijacked by the Islamist elements at the heart of it, namely by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and it was transformed into an Islamic revolution, and that's how Iran became an Islamic republic. And for those who were fighting against or pushing against their oppressors, whether it was President Anwar Sadat in Egypt or others in the region, they saw that example of how Islam could actually be successful and a theocracy could topple a despot. And it gave a lot of ideas to a lot of people from Egypt all the way to Pakistan. And the role of Islam as a powerful tool was born in that year. And of course, Khomeini tried to export his revolution as well. And that leads us to the birth of a group like Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was at the heart of the clashes in Beirut this week. The role of Islam as a political power, but also a militant power, also took root in Afghanistan, as the Soviets occupied Afghanistan and the Saudis, which had faced their own zealots inside their country, laid siege to the mosque in Mecca and were starting to worry about the grand designs of Khomeini, who had ambitions beyond Iran and beyond the Shia community. The Saudis saw an opportunity to lead the Muslim world in opposition to Iran by feeding and helping the fight against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Of course, the unintended consequences of what was then a good war are known to all, leading up to the withdrawal of the Americans today from Afghanistan. And so in that 1 year, you had the birth of political Islam as a potent power that could bring a theocracy to power. And you had the power of the gun that young hothead Muslims, zealots, but also bored and unemployed, suddenly discovered on the battlefield of Afghanistan.
Mhm. I'm glad you mentioned Pakistan, because in the Ziaul Haq, the dictator, who became kind of a willing conduit for America's jihad against the Soviets, right? After the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, he was getting a lot of money, billions of dollars to distribute among various groups. You say in your book that Peshawar was kind of a supermarket of jihadists at one point. And just like Beirut was a supermarket for leftist thoughts and, various revolutionaries. And I was happy to learn that Peshawar, the word, the name, comes from a Sanskrit word actually called Purushpura, meaning city of men. And boy, is it a city of men. Describe for us, how all these people were coming from Saudi Arabia, from other countries, and sort of taking over Peshawar. What did the local Peshawaris think about all this? And what happened? What were the dynamics at that time?
This goes to the heart of the transformation that this region went through. And I include Pakistan in sort of the greater area that I talk about, because it goes from Egypt to Lebanon, from Lebanon to Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And I include Pakistan. So it's this travel around the region across 40 years, 7 countries, and 15 characters whose lives we discover as they push back or try to push back against these changes. Because of course, what I describe in the book is this transformation of a region and of countries where you had diversity and pluralism, where you had cultural tolerance, where religion was not oppressive. And I describe how the changes are unleashed by the dynamics that 1979 pushes forward into the following decades. And Peshawar is one of those places that is completely destroyed almost by those dynamics and by war specifically. You mentioned Ziaul Haq, who was a dictator, but he was a dictator who was useful and friendly to the United States and to the West in this war. And I want to remind our audience that at the time it was a good war in the eyes of many against the Soviet occupation and the dangers of communism spreading. That was what was the view from the West, certainly, that this was a danger. And Ziaul Haq was a willing participant because it was a way for him to receive billions of dollars and to solidify his rule. And something that is a little bit unknown, I think perhaps less, of course, in Pakistan, but also in the region, but it was a little bit unknown to me, even though I traveled to Pakistan and reported from Pakistan And it just shows you how some of these transformations have become just accepted as a narrative by us today. I did not realize how much Pakistan had been transformed by the events of the 1980s and by Zia al-Haq, who, with the help of the Saudis and the help of American money, was not only helping the jihad effort in Afghanistan, but Islamizing his own country. And in Islamizing his own country, he transformed it into something that is almost unrecognizable to Pakistanis themselves. And something that really struck me as I was writing about Pakistan was how often women took to the streets to try to bring him down. All these protests throughout the 80s that got so little attention by the outside world, because that was not the headline that people wanted to read about. They wanted to read about Zia al-Haq, America's friend. And that's what I really try to tell as a story. It's the continuous push against this Islamization, against oppression, against the dictator, that gets so little attention from the outside world. And so today, when in the West, people ask, well, where are the moderate Muslims who are pushing back and speaking out against terrorism? The answer is in the pages of a book like Black Wave. The answer is that moderate people who believe in the separation of religion and state, who are maybe conservative Muslims, but believe in tolerance and believe in progressive values, have been at the forefront of this battle against extremism in their own countries for decades. That's what I try to really tell as a story in the pages of Black Wave. Unfortunately, Seema, very often those who are fighting for progressive liberal values end up in exile or end up being assassinated.
Absolutely.
People in like Jamal Khashoggi, for example, going forward a little bit, a very interesting character, Jamal Khashoggi, Saudi journalist who covered the war in Afghanistan, who spent a lot of time in Peshawar. I write about him in that section of the book, and who over time understood what had been unleashed by his own country and by the Pakistanis in that moment in time.
Perhaps, a question that comes to mind is the chicken and egg. Like, what came first? Was it Zia's project to Islamize his country, and he found the invasion of Afghanistan a convenient reason to jump in? You also say that Zia was actually one day ahead of Khomeini in, I did not know that, in imposing Sharia law in Pakistan. And he kind of bragged about it. Was he trying, in your opinion, since you've done research on this subject, was he trying to create kind of an Arab identity for Pakistan, a country which sort of is an identity orphan, if I may say so? They don't want to see themselves, especially post-Zia, as South Asian, as much as sort of looking more towards the Middle East. And South Asian Islam has always been kinder and gentler in many ways. Pakistani Muslims have more in common with Indian Muslims in terms of cultural norms, in terms of music, food, everything. So what do you think he was trying to do? Was he doing like a bigger project to just change the identity and come with the Middle East and leave South Asia completely on the sidelines and get money, of course, in exchange?
So, Zia al-Haq, I think, was just an opportunist, a dictatorial opportunist who saw a way of ruling and maintaining his rule by imposing with help of Saudi Arabia, which had, and that is actually to be very accurate, that project or that idea of the Saudis of starting to proselytize a little bit more behind their border had started in 1978 when it comes to Pakistan. 1979 just put that project on steroids. Before 1978, the Saudis would sort of, spend some money here and, distribute their largesse here and there, but it was still very haphazard. It wasn't methodical, and it was in many ways benign. It was their role as custodian of the two holy sites, and the project of the King Faisal Mosque in Pakistan was born during a visit of King Faisal prior to 1979. But what 1979 did was align the ambition, desire of Saudi Arabia, the world, that it was the real leader of the Muslim world, not Ayatollah Khomeini. He wanted that role for himself. And it was a bit of a competition there. And Zia al-Haq also felt was copying Khomeini, who was, starting to impose Islamic law, working to impose Islamic law in Iran. And as you rightly pointed out, he said, "Well, I was first," and that was kind of accurate. I don't think that Zia al-Haq, and I'm not an expert on his specific politics, I don't think that he was looking to impose an Arab identity on Pakistan. He was very much still, a Pakistani leader. I think the Saudis have poured did pour at the time a lot of money in the country, and there have been some changes in some of the words that Pakistanis use on a day-to-day basis when they describe prayer or fasting. They use the Arabic word instead of the Urdu word. But I have a lot of Pakistani friends who bristle at that. There's a lot of pushback against this effort by Saudi Arabia to bring Pakistan closer to the Arab world. I don't think it's a Pakistani desire to be part of the Arab world. I think it's a Saudi effort to try to bring Pakistan closer and to have this extra ally on its eastern flank. But I see a lot of pushback against that, including by Pakistani leaders who did not just show up when the Saudis asked them to participate in the war in Yemen. If you remember that episode in 2015, the Saudis thought that they could just snap their fingers and the Pakistanis would show up, and that did not happen. So I think that tells you something about where Pakistanis feel that they really belong.
Right. I mean, I completely agree with you that the civil society in Pakistan is not in favor of sort of, going completely into the Saudi camp or even Iranian camp. But the politicians, the army, the Pakistan army uses sometimes the dynamic to its advantage, So the people are caught in between. And the progressives in Pakistan, yes, I have a lot of friends there too, and they are fighting back. And I must say that I admire how much pushback they have done despite all the repression by various regimes, and hats off to them. In your book, I came across another very interesting fact that you say that one of the clues to 9/11 was a Pakistani religious thinker called Abu Ala al-Maududi, who had founded Jamaat-e-Islami. And he had met Khomeini in 1963 and then kind of went into obscurity. But Zia kind of revived him, and because he found him useful in his project, I suppose. Tell us, what were some of his influences on the larger region? Because Saudis saved him from being, I think, being imprisoned or executed or something like that, if I remember correctly.
So what's interesting about Abu Ala al-Maududi is, of course, he was born in what was then India. And initially, he was quite progressive, and he wrote poetry, verses that, if I remember correctly, have talk about women and drinking. And he had a slow transformation. It was the time of partition, of dislocation, of searches for identity. Both India and Pakistan are trying to find this new way forward. And what I found interesting was to rediscover Abu Ala al-Mawdudi as the source of much of the thinking behind the man who is usually thought of as having been at the source of most of the more extreme understanding of Islam, and that's Sayyid Qutb. It's always interesting to go back to peel the layers and to go back, one generation back to find out exactly where some of these thoughts are coming from. And what I found interesting about that is the the transnational nature of some of these exchanges, and the fact that Abu Ala al-Mawdudi had met Khomeini, a Sunni meeting a Shia, inspiring each other. Apologies for the darkness behind me, but we're having a power cut. Luckily, I have everything on backup for my internet and my ring light. The travails of operating in Lebanon today, but nothing will stop us from keeping going. So what I found interesting was this transnational exchanges across borders, across generations, and across sects. I mean, think about it, that Abu Ala al-Mawdudi and Khomeini had been in touch and had inspired each other. And perhaps Abu Ala al-Mawdudi had been inspired by Khomeini and had heard some of his thoughts about an Islamic Republic. And he, in turn, had then helped inspire some of the thinking in Pakistan, which allowed Zia al-Haq to be able to declare that he was actually first, before Khomeini, to declare his own Islamic Republic. Abu Ala al-Mawdudi was awarded a prize by the Saudis. And so that's how all these different personalities and these different histories overlap.
And there was light.
And there was light, yes.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the present times. We're coming close to our end times. So Saudi Arabia used a lot of different methods to spread Wahhabism in the 80s and 90s, checkbook diplomacy, financing newspapers, paying journalists to write a certain way. So I was wondering, you say that this black wave is receding in certain parts in the Middle East, but I might say that it's actually rising in a place like South Asia, because what you see in Afghanistan is a very, fundamentalist is a very polite word for the Taliban. They're talking about chopping off hands and things like that, and debating whether the chopped off limbs should be the property of the state or of the people. So can this genie be put back in the bottle? How do you see the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, for example, or Iran dealing with this latest manifestation in Afghanistan?
So I'll say two things. First, answering the present and the idea that the black wave is receding. I remain hopeful that it is receding, in the sense that the younger generation across the region thinks that religion has played too big a role in their lives in politics. We know that from opinion surveys across the region over the last few years. Mm-hmm. We know that also from the protests in Lebanon, in Iraq, but also in Iran over the last few years, by the young generation taking to the streets, pushing back against sectarianism, against religion, but mostly against sectarianism and these identities, the weaponization of sectarianism. So the fact that the Taliban can come back to power in Afghanistan does not necessarily undermine the idea that across the region, there is a desire to move away from religion. After all, you know, the Taliban don't represent the majority of Afghans, I don't believe, and they don't necessarily speak for the rest of the Muslim world. They certainly do not. But in the present, what Saudi Arabia and Iran are doing as a leadership, as they realize that the young generation is not interested so much in politics, is that they're resorting to nationalism to rally people around the flag. Populism are the worldwide trends. It's today's, zeitgeist from Europe to the United States and elsewhere. This is what is driving politics today. It's populism. But I wanted to say something about Saudi Arabia and Iran and how they operate differently, because it's a very clear difference. The Saudis, and I characterize a little bit, throw money at the problem. You know, they funded this effort of the Mujahideen. They give money to charities. They give money to people who will then open schools, madrasas, which is the Arabic word for school. You know, I went to a madrasa. It just happened to be a religious, it was run by priests, but it was called a madrasa in Arabic. But it was run by priests. So it has taken on this nefarious tone to it, but in Arabic, it means just simply school. And so the Saudis just throw money at the problem, and they give money to somebody, and then they sometimes give money to the opposite. So they'll give money to religious institutions in Egypt, and then they'll give money to start this satellite TV station that has music and belly dancers and movies, etc. So there's some contradiction there. But they create a lot of unintended consequences as they proselytize, and certainly did export not only extremism during the 80s and 90s, but also sectarian vitriol. At the heart of what is commonly known as Wahhabism, which is an ultra-Orthodox, literalist, puritanical understanding of Islam that forms the core of beliefs of the interior of Saudi Arabia, the very heart of the desert interior, is this very exclusionary version of Islam, which the Saudis had kept to themselves before 1979, but which they started to export after 1979 to push back against the Iranians, who were exporting their own version of extremism, except it was Shia. And so the Saudis have this progeniture out in the world. They fund the Mujahideen. They kind of help the Taliban. The Mujahideen give birth to Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden is a Saudi, but he wants to actually bring down the House of Saud himself. And the Saudis eventually also become a target of some of these groups.
Right, but how will they look at Taliban? How will this dynamic, in your estimate?
But let me just explain how the Iranians are different. The Iranians are very methodical in how they export their version of Shia state-led Islam, in how they set up proxy groups, charities, schools, institutions, and proxy militias, which is why today you have groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq that answer to the supreme leader. And in a way, those groups, if tomorrow suddenly, for whatever reason, the supreme leader in Iran wakes up and says, you know what, I'm done with this. I think this was a bad idea. I'm going to stop funding these groups, and I'm going to stop sending them arms, and I'm going to tell them to disband and go home and just be reduced to a political party. It would actually disempower them to a large extent, groups like Hezbollah. They would be able to maintain and continue some of their activities, but I think they would be reduced very quickly to local political parties. The opposite is not true of the groups that are a result of Saudi largesse and Saudi proselytizing and funding across the world. There is no way for the Saudis to actually put their genie back in the bottle, because they don't command them. they're not formed by the Saudi state, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. The Saudis today say that, they have no relation with the Taliban. I don't think they want to be involved in Afghanistan. I think they have learned some lessons from the past. But certainly if they see the Iranians try to use the Taliban to its advantage, then I think you'll see that rivalry reignite again in Afghanistan.
That's a very good point. If the Iranians get involved, so will the Saudis, like before. So yes, so that is something, people, because India is very, very concerned about the developments in Afghanistan and what might happen in the coming years. And as various groups gather, various terrorist groups that are known to reside there. So I have one quick audience question, if I can ask you. Chiara asks, the concept of a good cause transforming into what the world now sees of the Middle East conflict is very interesting and pertinent. How do social movements and idealism separate from state apparatus when violence has been at the heart of the latter through history? So
wow, this is a very philosophical question.
yes, it's a good question.
It's a very good question. I think that, very often the idealism of revolutionaries is thwarted by the pragmatism of realpolitik. And that applies to Iran's revolutionaries who did not expect that they would unleash and put in power someone worse than the Shah. They did not realize that they were replacing one despot with a worse one who would oppress them culturally, religiously, economically, and cut them off from the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that many Saudis, including housewives who were donating their jewelry for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, realized what they were really feeding. One of the mistakes that was made after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan was the Western was America walking away from the problem. Well, the Soviets are gone. This is it. We're done. We're leaving. And not realizing what had been unleashed. One, because the threat of Sunni radical jihadism was not really understood yet. The 80s had been marred by Iranian state-led terrorism, hijackings, hostages, bombings, etc. And the idea of Sunni extremism that could lead to terrorism was not well understood yet. So there was an inability to foresee what was going to happen. But another problem, which has been on my mind recently as I watched the unraveling of Afghanistan and Lebanon, but also Hong Kong, don't be surprised. I'm putting them all in one piece that is coming out in the Atlantic in the coming few days, is the idea of the inevitability of progress of democracy. The 90s was when, the Cold War had been won, and it was the end of history, as we were told. And this was, progressive values, liberal values, the advance of democracy everywhere. And the idea that, a faraway country that had been wrecked by civil war like Afghanistan could one day be the birthplace for violence that would touch America was not something that anybody could foresee. Mm-hmm. The idea that the progress made in the 90s towards democracy could be reversed, including with China and Hong Kong, was not something that anyone really could foresee in that moment. But it is very much what we're seeing today as China, basically, undoes democracy or the democracies and the freedoms that Hong Kong had. And as much of the systems that were put in place in the 90s are coming undone also in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm. Well, one might say that the refusal of the West to see the Chinese project is their own fault, largely, not the Chinese fault. They have, they have made their philosophy, their project very clear. They think in terms of millennia, and the West thinks in terms of one election cycle. And they often miss what's going on. But
the idea at the time was that allowing China into the World Trade Organization would inevitably lead to economic liberalization and liberalization full stop. And then came along Xi Jinping, who had very different ideas.
Right. Yes, that was something because the American corporations were making a huge amount of money in China, and China was much smarter, actually. They never followed the rules of the WTO. They got into the WTO, but anyway, there's one more question. Would the current dispensation under Imran Khan in Pakistan continue the pushback against the Saudi influence?
My understanding of where the Saudis are today and the Emiratis is that they're very much focused on their own domestic politics, their own domestic economy, and trying what was described to me by one Emirati official as a zero problem neighborhood policy, which, you could take at face value or with a huge grain of salt, considering past experience. But I think the experience of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in Yemen, in Libya, and also to some extent in Syria, has been such that they are going to be a lot more careful in how they engage in foreign policy and certainly in military adventures.
Kim, we lost track of time. It was so interesting talking to you. Thank you so much. And your book is amazing. And
thank you very much, Seema, for a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And over to you, the team at JLF.
Thank you, Kim and Seema, for a fascinating conversation. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers that are available through Brazos bookstore. If you liked our sessions, do consider supporting us through the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. We sincerely value your contributions. Once again, we would like to thank all our JLF Houston advisors, donors, and partners for generously supporting us. We hope you all enjoyed this conversation and will tune in for the next session, Why I Am Like Tequila, Lupe Mendez in conversation with Anailacia Sotelo at 12 p.m. Central Time, 10:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 10 a.m. Pacific Time, 11 a.m. Mountain Time, and 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you once again, and now presenting a reading from the JLF Writer Short Series.
Hi, I'm Rochelle Potkar, and I will be reading an excerpt from my short story collection, Bombay Hangovers. It is a collection of 16 short stories across class, caste, and religion in Bombay. This story is titled Fabric, and it follows the life of Kailas Ranade, whose textile mill dreams are shattered when glitzy malls sprout over Bombay. Karim Boy's Capola was the third mall in Bombay, better than Andheri, Shoppers Stop, and Worli's Crossroads. Kailas had sobered with the fact that he was at least still on the same land. Once in a blue moon, he would stride into the mall. The floors sounded off his footsteps as if he were a horse. He peered into glass doors and mirrors to check his reflection in the security guard's uniform, baggy purple shirt, with a badge of Elite Security Company Limited, and his name in white lettering. His hair had thinned, A belly protruded from under the tightest button. His back hunched. His arms were flabby. He would peer into cubicles that were shops stuck together with a division of glass. Sometimes he thought he was under a saw-roofed mill shed, his eyes searching for a north light. This was like an aquarium. You could see people crossing over the overhead bridge that arched inside the mall, traveling up elevators, coming down escalators, and entering shops. Only the trial rooms and lavatories had doors. Even the restaurants had glass walls, where people ate unrecognizable food. There are so many things that go into making fabric. Kailas remembered Kakabau's words. Not just toil, but the price of cotton, cost of raw materials, electricity, transport, labor, and the land price on which the mill stands. All threads going to shreds. He remembered how Chairman Khatau was gunned down in his Mercedes when he wanted to sell his 40-acre mill land. Kailas entered a shop to touch fabric. How stylish and thick the shirts of rich men had become now. Their black pleats, side pleats, darts, seams, sleeves, collars and yokes had changed, even in plain white and blue colors. Karim Boys wasn't interested in extending his production to hosiery and synthetic fibers, nor in increasing their export business. They simply loved the land on which the mill had stood bare. Zameen. The short Park Avenue was still beyond Kailas's reach. Foreign shirts had flooded the shops. Reed and Taylor, Arrow, and names he couldn't even pronounce. Van Heusen, Provogue, John Miller, Louis Phillips, Alan Solly, Blackberries, Parks, John Players, and Peter England. Kailas wondered if there were names of men given to shirts. His could have one too. Kailas Ranade, blue and white shirts. His favorite pastime was to watch men alighting from expensive cars in well-toned shirts that never creased. Soon, he read a man just by his shirt. Every man had to take care of the shirt on his back. Bombay hangovers do read.
So in that sense, I want to democratize the story of innovation. I want to make it clear that anyone can do it.
The basic question that a writer asks, I think, is, what should I write about? And, that's the biggest question. There's no help for you either. And it's a total mystery.
But what is common throughout history, throughout time, is that when you have that upstairs, downstairs thing, there's a certain amount of that you can maintain if you're on top through hard power and hard system.
We're absolutely delighted to be back here with our edition, albeit digitally, of JLF Houston. There are so many wonderful authors and speakers who you will hear over the next few days. And I hope they will power your imagination as they have ours to look into the future, into a brighter tomorrow.